Welcome to Spiritual Naturalism Today, a conversation on science, nature, and spirituality. Our program is sponsored by the Spiritual Naturalist Society with host Daniel Strain.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Daniel Strain, and I'm here with my co-hosts Jay Forrest and Lee Anderson. Hello, Jay.
Hello, how you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Hello, Lee.
Hi.
Thank you all for being with me on the program today, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in, where our audience is continuing to grow, and people are giving us some positive feedback, and we really appreciate it. Today we're going to be talking about non-attachment. We're going to talk about exactly what that means, especially in a spiritual naturalist context. And we're going to talk about how that compares with ideas of acceptance versus action in the world. So why don't we just go ahead and jump right into it. Jay, did you have any initial thoughts?
Well, I think whenever I think of people talking about non-attachment, I think the difficulty is I don't think people really, I mean, it's kind of a vague concept. Some people think of it's like detachment. You just, dropping out of the world and, disassociating yourself with everything, just, kind of tuning out of everything. And I don't think that that kind of concept is helpful. And distancing yourself and isolating yourself, I don't think is what's meant by non-attachment, at least within the Buddhist context. So I think we need to differentiate between non-attachment and detached, being detached from a situation. I think that might be a good thing to really distinguish.
Yeah, we were actually talking about this the other day, and on the surface, it may seem like it's an equivalent translation, non-attachment, detachment, but right. To me, detachment sounds like an action, like you have detached, whereas non-attachment is kind of a state of being. It's persistent, and the points you made about it are even more relevant. So we're going to obviously intersect with Buddhism a lot on this, but as spiritual naturalists, we have maybe a diversity of views regarding this, but all of these have to do with how these attachments kind of affect happiness. So, Lee, what are your thoughts about becoming attached or clinging, as they call it, and that effect on happiness? What are your experiences with that or thoughts about it?
Well, coming from the non-Buddhist perspective, anytime that I've heard different definitions or perspectives on non-attachment, I think what has stuck with me most is the concept of just trying to come at things from a compassionate perspective, and that's what non-attachment is, not letting your own personal motives or emotions get into it, but stepping back. Rather, I kind of like non-attachment as stepping back and then coming at a given situation or something from a compassionate perspective. So from the non-Buddhist perspective, that was the definition that I liked the most, and that's the way I think of non-attachment.
Yeah, that's interesting. Especially the part that when you talked about infusing compassion back into, taking that step back so that we can make sure that compassion is in there. I really like that a lot. To me, compassion is one of the things that drew me to Buddhism, but it's also some personal life experiences as I was getting into a number of different philosophies. Really convinced me of the power of compassion, and this is coming from somebody who I grew up kind of being analytical, and I would want to know, okay, what's the ethical model, and why is this ethical and that not ethical, and how a person should act, and rationality and all this stuff. And when you get into really complex situations, there's quite often times where you have to fall back on more of a virtue-based way of approaching things. You have to fall back on just trying to be a compassionate person rather than trying to calculate out all of the particular courses of action that you think are going to lead to this or that result.
Yeah, it's kind of the difference between ethics based on rules and ethics based on something within you, that virtue idea, the inner qualities. And that's I think an important aspect that Lee pointed out, is that the real difference between non-attachment and detachment is, in non-attachment, compassion isn't eliminated. Detachment requires you to completely disassociate and disconnect. And I think that the compassion is the element that keeps you in the midst of the suffering of the world, the suffering of your friends and family and people that you know, that keeps you connected but not attached. I always like because one of the articles I wrote was the difference between non-attachment and love. How can you be not attached and love? Because we think of love as attachment. Where I always thought that the best illustration I ever heard was, there's two ways to pray when you're praying or folding your hands. You can put the hands where they're connecting, they're straight, the usual Buddhist pose where the hands are touching but they're not interlaced. And then the praying where the fingers are interlaced, like they're interconnected, you can't pull them apart. And for me, when the hands are touching each other in the regular, prayer pose thing, the prayer hands, and they're just, the faces are touching each other, you can pull away. There's nothing stopping free flowing of. So that's connection and non-attachment can go together. But when you fold them in and the fingers are interlaced, you can't pull away, and that's attachment.
That's interesting. That's really interesting.
I like that.
In fact, it's kind of neat because it kind of allegorically connects to the Eastern, Western styles of doing the hands. That's really a neat concept.
And the other thing, when you think about it, when they are interlaced, not only is the other person bound to you, but you're bound to them. So you actually give up your freedom when you're attached. We always think of attachment, being a bad thing as far as us, but it's also a bad thing for the other person. It doesn't give them the freedom to be who they are. And so many times we want to control people and control situations. And we can't. I mean, realistically, and that's one of the teachings of the Stoics, is you need to be realistic on what you really do have control over. And one of the things we do have control over is the idea of non-attachment, where we can be connected with somebody, we can have an intimate relationship, but we're not trying to control them and they're not trying to control us. It's a mutual, beneficial, sharing together, compassionate relationship. And that's the healthiest relationship. To me, there's 3 stages of emotional development. First, you have the I, me, my, the selfishness, the complete dependence. You are here to serve me. And that's what we grow up as kids. We're dependent upon our parents. And that's fine. That's part of growing. But then you learn independence, where you kind of go your separate ways, do your own thing. And then you get to the point of real maturity, which is interdependence, where you can have that connection with other people, but you let them have their independence as well. It's kind of a combination between dependence, that means you have the connection, but independence means you don't try to control.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that whole thing about is the love self-based? Are you trying to love because you're trying to fulfill some need of yours, and that's the primary concern, or are you being a loving being? I heard somebody say once that, if you're trying to be a compassionate being, a loving being, then it's not that they love this person and don't love this person, or they love that and don't love that. It's not about deciding who gets to be the beneficiary of your love and who doesn't. It's when you're with a tree, you love trees. When you're with a squirrel, you love the squirrel. When you're with another person, you love the other person because you simply love. It's not about it's about the nature of who you're trying to be, what kind of person you're trying to become.
Yeah.
I really, one of the things I mentioned to Jay and Lee before our program is that I'd done a presentation at a local Buddhist temple that my wife and I go to this past week on impermanence. And there's a kind of a lot of overlap here between concepts of impermanence and non-attachment, because accepting impermanence is part of that. But whenever you start to accept things, like Jay said, accepting the what you can control and what you can't, and we start talking about acceptance, and people get confused by that too, because they start to think that acceptance means letting things happen without acting, or letting somebody walk all over you, or not doing what you need to do to, according to virtue and duty and what's right, not calling the police if they need to be called, not taking action. And acceptance in these kind of ways is referring to inner peace. And so it's possible for a person to do everything they need to do, but their motivation is not what most of the world usually thinks of as motivation. They think, oh, well, if there's some injustice, we got to get angry. We get angry, that'll be our fuel for action. Or we got to get mad, or we got to, whatever. But these are just different forms of greed and attachment. And so if you take all that away, though, and you say, oh, well, I'm going to learn how to, have this inner peace, this acceptance, what then becomes the basis for action? And that goes back to what you said, Lee. You've got to replace hate, anger, reactionary things like that, and greed. You got to replace it with something to be the motivation for action, and that's where compassion becomes so important, because that then is the motivation.
I think currently the state that we're all in is such that we have all kinds of technology and things coming at us immediately. And I heard this past week something that made me stop and think. People don't know how to be bored anymore. And a lot of things in the past, a lot of creative things, writers, artists and things came out of boredom. But these days we tend to react immediately, because if we have 1 second that we're waiting in a line at the grocery store and nothing's happening, we pull out our phone and we start reading on it, or we start using social media and things like that. And to me, the concept of non-attachment with action is, again, that whole stepping back and stop before you take action and get into the right mode. So like you said, people react, immediately with anger, or, they're upset about things, and they go in and take actions that don't come from that perspective of compassion. And it all comes from the fact that we think we need to react immediately, and I don't believe we do.
Yeah, I think the reacting is one of the difficulties. Instead of acting, many times we react. And when we do that, unfortunately, what happens in reaction is things come out that we didn't mean. We didn't mean to say that. We didn't mean to do that. We didn't really think out the consequences of saying or doing that. And then, we have to learn to say, okay. And that's why I like the idea of wisdom and compassion. sometimes we just want to go and help, and sometimes we make it actually worse because we haven't thought about the wisdom of helping, and we end up in power in a situation that we should not in power. But the thing that you brought up, which I think is really a symptom of our time, is this attachment to constant stimulation through social media and texting and the internet and everything like that. You're
podcasts
right.
And
Except for really good podcasts. But it is a difficulty because you don't have any time to think. It's always input, 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 input. When is the time that you contemplate? When is the time that you reflect on the things in your life? When is the time that you just get away, go outside, sit under a tree, go for a walk by a stream, and just think about how your life is going, the choices that you're making. This is where the wisdom comes from. It comes from science or silence and solitude. And we don't have that anymore.
Sometimes just not even thinking, just sitting and being and trying to get outside of the thought trap of just everything being words and logical arguments and conditions, and trying to just listen, see, experience in a very raw form.
Just be there, instead of always having to produce. We're in a production-oriented society where we either doing one or two things. We're either consuming or we're producing for someone else's consumption. Yeah. And that keeps our mind constantly in a whirl. And it comes back to that old metaphor. The best way to clear up water is to let it settle, to let it rest, to let it just be without stirring it. And that's the same with the mind. A lot of people want to sit down, they want to meditate, they want inner peace, and they want it now. That's not how it works.
And it takes patience, and it takes diligence too to see results of meditation over time.
Yeah.
But a lot of people have a real problem. This thing about media has created a lot of extreme mental habits that people get, and they get to where they can't sit alone with themselves. And I remember seeing some kind of, I don't really have the reference for it offhand, but something where people would begin to give themselves shocks rather than sit there quietly. Some kind of experiment.
Yeah, it was an experiment. Yeah, it was an experiment. What they did is they wanted to see just how much we cannot be alone with ourselves. And the experiment, it was at a university is what it was. And what they did is they actually had ability to shock themselves, or they just had to sit there. And the longer the period, the more people would just something for some stimulus, something, give me something. Mm-hmm. Because we're scared of the inner silence, the void within us, the deeper questions. They're uncomfortable, and we'd rather, stimulate ourselves with pain than to actually face some of the questions within ourselves.
So, Lee, you live out in a very beautiful area, and you've talked about that before. Being out there, being in nature, and walking around your property and everything, and I imagine that gives you a lot of ample opportunity to just be.
It does, if I take it. And again, at times, I can become so caught up in the same thing, even with family and with friends and with volunteering and things like that, that I'll find myself thinking, ooh, I haven't walked outside in 3 days, even though it's been sunny and, nice weather and everything. And so it is one of those things that you need to make a priority. It does not come naturally. We just, in this day and age, have to work at it.
That's a great point, because one of the things that I see that we're doing here in the society, we publish 4 articles a month, and then we put out this podcast one a month, and then any number of other various projects and posts and things that we're doing and communications and stuff. And it's a lot going on, and people read these things, and I'm very proud of our writers. They do a wonderful job. They have excellent articles. I think they've been very helpful to people. But I wonder sometimes, what percentage of people, and I imagine it's a large chunk, are interested in spiritual naturalism. They're interested in these practices, and they're in their busy life, and they're doing their stuff, and they're going through their media, and they're checking their Facebook, and they see the article, and they think, oh, that article looks really neat. It's about spirituality or this spiritual practice, and they get it, and they read it, and then they kind of go on and do other things. They read something else, and they end up reading a lot of things, but at some point where the rubber meets the road, if you're going to benefit from this stuff, it's got to affect some part of your schedule. You've got to, like you said, make the time. There's got to be a thing where you put on your calendar, on your schedule, 3:00, I am going to go sit with a tree, or I'm going to meditate, or I'm going to whatever, There has to be some outward action so that if a Martian was watching you with a scanner, something different is happening,
Which leads me to the obvious question: what do you do, Daniel, to do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I
know how busy you are. You've got business, you've got
Yes.
the society, you've got friendships and everything else going. How do you make the time to do that? Because honestly, I mean, I write for the society and I'm on the podcast and stuff, but it's still a struggle for me, and I've limited a lot of what I do just so that I do have time for that.
Yeah, it is a lot of time. There's a list, at least a page long of things that I have not yet gotten to that I'm supposed to have done this week, and that's just S&S stuff. Not even talking about my day job and my family life and all that kind of stuff, and time for, just recreational activities and things like that. It's very, very. I end up being really busy, and I'm kind of right on the edge. I'm like where I'm like, sometimes I notice I'm like, whoa, this is getting a little out of hand. I need to take some time. I need to look at my schedule. I need to shift some things out. So there's certainly like a schedule management kind of thing that I have to do, and I have to be very careful and watch myself because I have always had a tendency to put too much on my plate. And what helps me generally is making time for meditation. That's a biggie. Days that I meditate are much better than days that I don't. If I just take that time to meditate, we have a little room I've mentioned it before, we have a little Harry Potter-like room under our stairs, and we turned it into a little meditation chamber kind of thing. We put up stuff in there and everything, and you can go in there, close the door, and it's a little meditation triangle. And it's lovely. I like it a lot, but I have to actually make time to get in it and do my meditation. The other day, I was kind of at one of those points where I was like, the gap has gotten too small here. So fortunately, it was a real pretty day outside. It was good weather, and I went out and I took my shoes off so I could feel the grass, and left my phone inside and just went and sat and took some time, and also taking time for reading. One of the things that's hard for me is that all of the work we do with the Spiritual Naturalist Society is about spiritual practice, but I have to constantly remind myself that stuff I'm doing for the society is not my practice time. I have to make a separate time for that. It's more like logistical, organizational type stuff, so.
Right. Lee, how about yourself?
As we've been having this conversation and specifically talking about non-attachment with action, I've been thinking about, my practice is that I do get up in the morning and almost without fail, I start my day, with meditation. But meditation itself is not a problem-solving activity. And where I'm thinking about non-attachment with action, what I'm missing out on are those walks out in nature where I can do the stepping back and think about a problem and how can I solve that problem in a compassionate manner. So I need to actually add into my schedule things like that specifically to solve issues and things that may come up from that type of perspective. I've gotten a lot out of the conversation already.
Well, good, because I think what you brought up is a good thing. It's really, a lot of even what Daniel was saying, a lot of what we do is we're so busy doing that we don't have time to think of, wait a second, what am I doing? What are my priorities? Am I getting in the time I need? And sometimes it doesn't, some people it doesn't need to be, the formal meditation where you sit down and you meditate for half an hour. Sometimes it is that walk in nature where the artificial is just, it's gone and you're in the natural environment. You're feeling the breeze and it relaxes you, and you actually center yourself just doing that. That's one of the things that as a family we try to do. Is we have a bosque here in Albuquerque, and it's the wooded area right by the Rio Grande, and just to go out there, it just refreshes, it kind of readjusts your mindset, and you just come back to, wait a second, all these other things really aren't as important as they feel. We get so wrapped up in the mind world that we forget to come back to the natural world. And for me, I think the biggest insight that I got, at least within the last couple of years, is to listen to your body. A lot of times you sit down to meditate and you just don't listen. Your body's a lot wiser than you might realize. And I realize now when I begin meditation, the first thing I do is check in with my body, find out where the tension is. And sometimes that tension will actually key you into what's bothering you. It's to me, it's an amazing thing, the ability of the body to communicate to you if you're able to listen to it. It's hard at first because some of us are so tense, we're so tight that we don't even realize we are. And so one of the things that was suggested is you tighten up everything and then relax it, because you actually bring it to full tension, and then when you relax, you realize, oh wait, I guess I wasn't as relaxed as I thought.
Yeah, that's a great point. I like to start with a body scan where you imagine this
Exactly.
like a laser line around your head, and it moves down over your body, and as it moves down, you relax and release those muscles. And what I find is that the muscles between my eyebrows, I don't even realize that I've been doing this, scrunching it and my eyebrows are tight together, and and then I release my brow, and I realize that tells me I've got a lot of tension there. Listening to your body, you can also listen to your mind. I mentioned before when we were talking about meditation, there's a lot of different Buddhist words for these different kinds of meditation, but I like to think of it in kind of three general categories. You've got meditation, contemplation, and introspection. And so, like with meditation or mindfulness meditation on the breath, these are three different techniques, but they all kind of like interplay with each other, like strengthen one another. Like with mindfulness meditation, you you're focusing on either the breath or some other kind of constant thing, and as your attention inevitably wanders off from it as you think of things, you bring the attention back, and you keep bringing it back, bringing it back, bringing it back. And that trains you to be able to turn your attention where you want it to be, when you want it to be, with more and more control, and still the rest of the mind. And that's really helpful for when you were talking to Lee earlier about stepping back, taking a moment, not getting caught up in something and reacting right away. Well, if you're real trained with your focus like that from your meditation, it will actually have that applicability when it comes to action, later on. And so that's the one kind. The other kind, the introspection, is kind of where you allow the things to rise and you simply watch them. And so it's kind of like noticing what your body's telling you, but you're noticing what your mind's telling you, because those things that come up will tell you what's on your mind, will tell you what's occupying your subconscious. You'll start to learn about yourself and you learn about what's on your mind. And then the third one, the contemplation, is a more directed thing, but instead of letting loose, but instead of directing on just a thing like the breath, it's directing on a specific problem or puzzle, and you're methodically working through that like a logical argument, trying to figure out something. But all of those different varieties of meditation, they all, help one another, help you get better at the other kind, but then more importantly, they all help with real life applicable things out in the world.
And I think that's what I'm missing, is the contemplative meditation, the walking meditation.
Yeah.
I was going to say I always like to think of the difference between direct vision and peripheral vision when we think of meditation. There's the direct vision where you actually direct your attention to like the breath, the body, things like that. And then there's the peripheral meditation where you just like, I remember the story, I forget which, it was a Vipassana teacher who said, it's like you sit in a room, you sit in the chair, and you just observe and see who comes into the room. Just observe, see who's visiting you. What are the thoughts that are coming in, the emotions that you're feeling, even the noises, and just it's an open awareness is what it's called. An open awareness, and just be the observer. And you can find out fascinating things about yourself and about your mind by just becoming an observer. Now, of course, you have to have some level of concentration to get to the point where you can do that without being carried away, because it's very easy. You're sitting in the room watching things come in and out, and in comes you need to make sure you pick up this at the store. And then all of a sudden,
pretty soon you're swept away with it.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's what makes it hard, is getting to the point where you can just be the observer and not engage the thought. Let the thought come, let the thought go. It's kind of like a bird flying over your head. You can't control it, but just observe it. But don't let it build a nest in your hair. That's the balance of those things, is to observe it, to let it be, let it come. And you'll see thoughts arise. They last for a little while, and then they dissipate. They go away. And that's how the mind works. It's a complete ingress, digress of thoughts just flowing in and out. And to become the observer of that is fascinating. It's almost like watching the ocean and the tides come in and out. It's an amazing experience and an insightful one, because you'll begin to see a recurring thought. And you'll be like, I guess I was more troubled about this than I thought, because it keeps coming back. Because it has an attraction to something that you're holding on to. And that's when we get into the non-attachment. The thing is, people, when they talk about non-attachment, they say, well, that's, a wonderful theory. How do you do it? Well, let go. Well, that's a nice theory. The problem with being able to let go of your attachments is first to see the attachments. Because honestly, we're attached to many things. even, after a decade of Buddhist meditation, I still find myself attached to things and going, well, why didn't I see that before? So I think the first step in non-attachment, the very, very, very first step is getting a perspective, getting the sight to see the attachment. Then the second thing is to find out why is it attached? What is it that you're trying to hold on to? It's kind of like gripping something. It's hard to be non-attached when you're grabbing onto something so tightly. And just releasing that item in your hand is like non-attachment. It's a very difficult thing because it's a mental process and not a physical one. And many times we don't see that it's not just one thing we're attached to. There might be multiple strands that we're attached to that particular thing or that particular outcome or something that we want to take place in the world that we just, in our lives that just we won't let go because we have to control it. So the idea of non-attachment and control go together because you can't be non-attached in that which you're trying to control.
Yeah. And when you're doing this kind of meditations where you're watching your thoughts, what you're doing is you're practicing viewing yourself. You're practicing being aware so that those thoughts, you're not associating them anymore. And that gap between the thoughts you're having and the impulses you're having in you start to become more and more apparent to you over time.
Right.
So that the urge doesn't necessarily, even things as innocuous as like learning how to sit without itching or readjusting every few minutes.
Yes.
Just something like that starts to teach you the separation between you and these requests coming into your brain all the time for your attention and your action.
Yeah, and that's usually my suggestion when I'm guiding people on meditation, and this whole thing is start small. It's easier to see the small stuff. Like when you're sitting in a meditation and you've got the incredible itch. It's like the worst itch. You're going to die of this itch. That's the point that you begin to learn non-attachment. Letting it be, letting yourself realize this will increase, then it will decrease, and then it will go away. That whole process in itself is actually teaching you the mental, giving you the mental muscle to let go of things and the skill to let go. And it really is a skill. It's a skill that we're not born with. We're born in a society that has multiple attachments and addictions, and to learn to just, in something as small as an itch, just to let it go, just to let it be. Let it have its, sensation, watch the sensation, pay attention to the sensation, and then just watch it disappear. And that's how you deal with other larger attachments, is you just let it be there. Because one of the things, our first response to anything is try to push it away. Try to change the reality. And we can change it by trying to pull things towards us or push things away. Well, pulling things towards us is attachment, and pushing things away is the whole idea of aversion. And the problem is we try to take reality and we push and pull on it all the time, and we're never just with it. Just accept it as it is, and then work with what is rather than the illusions that we create about it. And that's what changes everything, is you're actually working with reality as it is rather than how you conceive it or how you'd like it to be or your aspirations or your fears. You're actually with reality as is, and that is the key to non-attachment. And change. It's that idea of action. Action from the point of seeing reality as it is completely different than action out of your needs and your biases and your prejudice and your fears, your aspirations. It's a completely different perspective.
And people think that that's what's needed to do the right thing or to act, but often that kind of motivation will simply make your actions unbalanced and erratic and less precise. And
Yeah, because you're fighting an illusion, a mind created illusion. You're fighting something that doesn't exist. You're trying to change what isn't there in a way that doesn't work. That's why we get stuck in the circle. Is we create the problem and then we solve the problem and create the problem by solving the problem, because we're not getting to the problem.
yeah.
The problem isn't reality. It's the way that we deal with reality. It's the way we look at reality. One of the very first of the Eightfold Noble Path is right view. That's the beginning, because if you don't have the right view, if you're not willing to see reality as it is, you're going to be continuing messing around with things that don't matter, that aren't there, that are illusions of the mind, delusions.
Or we attach to things that as though they were impermanent, even though they're permanent. I mean,
Well,
as though they were permanent, even though they're
Yep.
impermanent. And if we appreciated them as impermanent, and we constantly had that in mind,
Yep.
we shift our perspective over time through these practices, so that we naturally react to the world as it is, as the reality truly is, rather than having to remind ourselves of it constantly. That's when it starts to change the emotional reactions that come up.
Right. That goes right into the whole idea of, we think that this is permanent. You know, if you have a headache, you think the headache's going to last forever. It's never going to go away. And the reality is in a flux. The only thing that doesn't change is change. Change will constantly happen. That's part of the nature of reality, which means relationships will end, new ones will begin, people will die, people will be born. Things change. Nothing is permanent. And when we realize that nothing is permanent, then we're not trying to make it what it's not, which is permanent. We're trying to make things, we're trying to freeze everything in concrete because we like it just like this. Stop this moment. Well, reality doesn't work this. It doesn't stop. It continues to change. And that's part of accepting. You know, the one side of it is non-attachment. The other side of that is acceptance. That means I accept what is as it is. Now, how do I cope with that? How do I deal with that? How do I relate to that wisely in a way that actually makes a difference? Or if I can't make a difference, just let go. It's going to be the way it is. You know, it is what it is. And me fighting about it, frustrating about it, yelling at somebody about it, or that's not going to change it. So why waste the energy in that when I could put it on something more productive?
Yeah, coping with it is actually, I should mention there's an article out this month on our website. It's an article I wrote about coping with impermanence. And there's a lot of overlap, like I said before, between this issue of impermanence and the issue of non-attachment. Because that's why we attach, because we imagine, we forget impermanence. We forget the truth of impermanence.
Exactly.
And of course, that attachment, when the impermanence inevitably takes place, lost job, lost relationships, what have you, that ripping away of what you're attached to, that's the source of suffering.
Yep.
But, you know, the reason I suggested that our topic be not just non-attachment, but non-attachment in action is because so often I hear the misunderstanding that these philosophies that teach equanimity and peace and acceptance and that sort of thing, they get misinterpreted as meaning passivity, outward passivity, external passivity.
Correct.
And that's a misinterpretation.
Yeah, and that's, I think, probably the most common when you talk about non-attachment. I think that's the common idea, whether it's, you know, non-attachment in love or non-attachment in action. The key here is understanding that non-attachment is just giving you a perspective on the changeable parts and the non-changeable parts. that which you have an influence over and that which you don't. Back to the Stoics. That's really what it is. It's you're getting a wise mind of the situation. That's what non-attachment gives you. Now you can change something with wisdom or accept it, because in wisdom you know that it's not changeable. So it's not that it's contrary to action. In fact, it should be the basis of action. And back to what Lee said earlier, it's not just non-attachment, it's not just acceptance, it's also compassion, giving you the motivation, giving you the fire for it. A fire has two parts. It has light and heat. Non-attachment will give you the light. Compassion will give you the heat.
Yeah. Lee, I'm sure you meant before when you were talking about compassion, I'm sure you meant to include self-compassion in that, didn't you?
Yes, most definitely.
Yeah, I think that's important. I like to phrase it like, I love the phrase compassion for all beings, not compassion for others, because in Buddhism there are no others. There's the separation between self and others is delusional. But compassion for all beings, and well, I'm a being, so having compassion for yourself, I think, is a good core to that. That's usually easier for people to start with, and then they try to radiate it outwards.
Well, I think we're also harder on ourselves than anyone else is anyway, so that is a good place to start.
Yeah, what I find interesting are examples of that where someone will be leading kind of a self-destructive life, and then they have a child, and then they start shaping up because they're trying to make a life for the child. And it's like it was easier for them to love this other being than it was for them to love themselves. And that's often even harder for people to, like you said.
That actually would be a good topic for a whole podcast, is self-compassion.
Yeah.
Because it's a big topic.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree.
We'll add it to our. We have a running list of topic ideas that we work on and try to keep for everybody. So, guys, it looks like we're getting pretty close to our end time. Any other closing thoughts?
Lee?
I think we've covered everything. I really enjoyed listening to Jay's conversation on what he teaches others as far as non-attachment means.
Yeah, it's one of those topics that's just it's such an important teaching, but it really doesn't have much depth if you don't actually have a practical real world application. When you can see, oh, I see how this works in this situation. Then it becomes, well, actually, it's kind of an important concept and an important practice to do, and it's an ongoing practice, because unless you're a completely enlightened being, if such a being exists, you're going to have attachments. That's part of being human. It's part of being in the real world. The key is to work with those attachments that are hurting you the most. The ones that are causing the most damage to you or to your friends and family, those are the ones to work on the most. And to get free of those. There's other attachments, to chocolate or whatever that's, usually isn't, a world-shaking, life-destroying thing. So work on the attachments that are doing the most damage in your life. Get to the point where you're seeing what the attachment is, what's connecting you to that particular thing or person, and then beginning to let go of those areas. And you'll find a growing freedom, a ability to move that you didn't feel before. And that little wiggle room will continue to grow as the non-attachment grows, as you begin to get better insights into why the attachment was there, What were you trying to change? What were you trying to make permanent that was impermanent? What were you not letting go? And that's how you grow into the whole field of non-attachment. Because it's not something you sit down, meditate, and you got it.
Right. It's like, I noticed that like a lot of these teachings that we talk about can very easily sound like very superficial euphemisms or internet memes or something like that, the sunset with a nice little phrase or whatever. And it's very easy to mistake that, but it's more like when you start putting it into real practices of self-development over time, it becomes more like an onion, where each time you read these things, you realize that they had a deeper meaning which you thought they had, and you kind of unravel it and go deeper and deeper. And as you start to see those changes in yourself, you start to see how it affects your life.
Exactly.
Well, I want to thank everybody for listening and joining us today. Thank you, Lee, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jay.
All right, appreciate it.
And I'm going to put my hands together in appreciative palm to palm and say thank you and namaste. And please join us next month for our next issue, and feel free to take a look at our past issues on our website. And we'll see everybody next time.
This program was sponsored by the Spiritual Naturalist Society. Learn more and become a member at spiritualnaturalistsociety.org. Our music was composed by John Clemisrude. Jay Forrest is our technical director. Please share our program and join us next time on Spiritual Naturalism Today.